The New Orleans Saints may be a little bit desperate to solve their quarterback issues over the course of this offseason, but are they desperate enough to go after Carson Wentz? The answer should be no. We got all that and a little bit of lagniappe for you on today's episode of Locked On Saints.
You are Locked On Saints, your daily New Orleans Saints podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is good, Who Dat Nation and Who Dat family? Welcome into another episode of Locked On Saints, your daily podcast covering your favorite team, the New Orleans Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thanks so much, as always, making Locked On Saints your first listen of the day every day. Don't forget, we're free and available on your favorite podcast app and on YouTube as well. I'm your host, Ross Jackson, at Ross Jackson Nola on Twitter, your New Orleans Saints expert, credentialed member of the media, CrescentCitySports.com, USA Today's Saints Wire, Tuesdays on Locked On NFL, and here with you every single Monday through Friday on Locked On Saints. And on today's episode of Locked On Saints, we're going to be joined by cap specialists over at Pro Football Focus. What is wrong with me? Pro Football Focus, as well as a contributor over to Over the Cap, Brad Spielberger. He's come to talk about whether or not the salary cap is going to catch up with the New Orleans Saints at any time in the near future. And we're also breaking down some options for the team's non-QB needs. But to get started with the show, let's talk QB needs, because let's face it, the New Orleans Saints are desperate, but they are not and should not and cannot be desperate enough to think that Carson Wentz will be the answer to their problems. Why are we talking about Carson Wentz? Well, on Monday, he was officially released by the Washington Commanders, basically in favor of Sam Howell, who has barely taken NFL snaps so far in his career. Now, Sam Howell was excellent coming out of North Carolina, particularly the penultimate year before his graduation, but still, he's somebody that has a lot of hype around him coming into the NFL. We'll see what he turns out to be, but basically, you've moved on from Carson Wentz for somebody that is entirely unproven. And why? Because Carson Wentz can never and has never lived up to his potential, unfortunately, since the injury that ended what felt like an MVP season that Nick Foles would eventually end up soon carrying to a Super Bowl. So why not Carson Wentz? So the first thing I want to do here is I just want to show you, right? Our friends here over at FanDuel Sportsbook, having a lot of fun, putting up a fill in the blank. Carson Wentz will play for the blank next season. And if I had to make my pick, the thing that I would say here is Carson Wentz will play for the anything but New Orleans Saints next season. I think that it is that serious. I think Carson Wentz is one of those quarterbacks that just unfortunately did not and will not pan out, despite how promising he was when he first got to the NFL, how promising he was throughout his collegiate career. Let's just take a look at some of the things that Carson Wentz has done or not done over the course of the past couple of years. Carson Wentz is one of a total of 36 quarterbacks who have taken at least 200, or that had at least 200 passing attempts, let's say it that way, in 2022. Of those, he did have a pretty good big-time throw percentage, according to Pro Football Focus, 4.4. That made him 12th in the NFL. But let's look at some of the stats that judge how good or not good a quarterback is. So we'll start off with NFL passer rating, which doesn't tell the full story, but does tell some of the story, and then we'll fill in some more contributing factors here. With an 80.2 passer rating in 2022, Carson Wentz was 30th out of 36. The quarterbacks that he was over the top of: Deshaun Watson, Baker Mayfield, Davis Mills, Kenny Pickett, Joe Flacco, and Zach Wilson, just under Russell Wilson and Matt Ryan. Every single one of those quarterbacks, maybe with the exception of Baker Mayfield when he finally landed in Los Angeles, at least for a little bit, had dreadful seasons. And so too did Carson Wentz, who threw 11 touchdowns as well as 9 interceptions. And had it not been for an injury that ended up actually sitting him to the sideline, he probably would have ended up being benched anyway. During his time with the Washington Commanders, he started them off with a 2-5 start. Meanwhile, Taylor Heinicke walked into the building, won 5 out of their first 6 games with Washington. There's a lot of question marks to be had around Carson Wentz. And one of them is he ever going to be the same after the injury? And there's 2 stats here that help to tell a story as a whole as to why I don't believe that is going to be the case, that he won't ever really get back there. Carson Wentz was one of the most protected players when it comes to the sheer number of snaps that he spent under pressure versus snaps that he was on the field. So again, out of all these quarterbacks that took at least 200 passing attempts, Carson Wentz was pressured only 105 times. Deshaun Watson played fewer snaps and had fewer passing attempts, but was pressured only 73 times. So you can see where this all goes. Brock Purdy, for instance, pressured 87 times. And then there were some guys that had more passing attempts or less passing attempts that were actually pressured more. You look at Zach Wilson, he was pressured 111 times. So Carson Wentz pretty well protected for the volume of snaps that he was able to take in those 7 games. So again, only 105 pressures total, but he had one of the highest, and when I say one of the highest, I mean the 6th highest, pressure to sack percentage in the NFL. That falls behind guys like Baker Mayfield at 30.8, Deshaun Watson at 27.4, and there was also Justin Fields as well as Russell Wilson that were in the 27% area. Carson Wentz at 24.8. So one of the things that used to make Carson Wentz special was his mobility. He wasn't a dual threat quarterback by most stretches of the imagination, certainly not by the measure of today's dual threat quarterbacks, but he was mobile enough to extend plays, mobile enough to evade pressure, and mobile enough to pick up some yards for you as well. That quality that helped to make Carson Wentz so special ended up not being able to be on display at all over the course of his most recent seasons. And again, that average depth of target that he had was just 7.9 yards, 21st or tied for 21st out of 36 in the NFL. So didn't look to push the ball downfield, anything like that. Just for reference, where was Andy Dalton on that average depth of target list? Andy Dalton, 8.4, so a full half yard on average more with more passing attempts. So that should tell you a little bit as well. One of the other things that we use to sort of measure a quarterback is how they operate under pressure. Only a pretty low here. He had when kept clean, 81.7 passer rating. So that barely would have lifted him up above where he ranked normally or as a whole. When he was under pressure, though, that passer rating dropped to 75.9. Beyond that, another measure that will give you a little bit of information in terms of where he is as a quarterback is looking at the net yards. What is it? Net. I want to make sure I say it right. Net yards per passing play. So this takes into account passing attempts, completions, interceptions, sacks, all of those things. Andy Dalton, by the way, number 9 on this list at 6.7. Carson Wentz coming in at a dreadful 5.3. There are 34 quarterbacks that qualified for this statistic. Carson Wentz was number 31. This is not the guy that you choose over Andy Dalton, even though he's younger than Andy Dalton. So if you don't get Derek Carr, and you look around the landscape and say, oh, well, maybe Carson Wentz is kind of in that second tier, I can guarantee you he is not. And we can't sit here and try to play the old song anymore of, hey, maybe a change of environment will help him, because a change of environment to Indianapolis didn't, a change of environment over to Washington didn't, and there's no offensive mastermind in New Orleans any longer. There's a defensive mastermind, but not an offensive guy that maybe makes you think, hey, get him to New Orleans and see what he can do with offensive mastermind. That does not exist any longer. There is no reason that the New Orleans Saints should be rolling the dice on Carson Wentz when you basically have an upgraded Carson Wentz, even though he's been in the league longer, even though he's older, in Andy Dalton. And I'll go beyond that. Not only do you have Andy Dalton as an already upgrade over Carson Wentz, you have Jameis Winston that's technically still under contract. You remind everybody of that when he was in the booth here in New Orleans at the HBCU Legacy Bowl. He is still under contract with the New Orleans Saints. And if the Saints decided to keep him around, I think, barring that injury, barring his recovery, there's a chance that Jameis Winston in 2023 still plays better football than Carson Wentz has throughout the majority of his career. It's a hard pass for the New Orleans Saints and Carson Wentz. Coming up next, Brad Spielberger of PFF is going to join to tell us why the cap might not catch up on the New Orleans Saints, because as long as there's a salary cap to kick the can down the road, the New Orleans Saints can continue to kick that can down the road. We got that coming up for you as we continue on with today's episode of Locked On Saints. Today's episode brought to you by our friends over at Built.com, the best tasting protein bars on the market. Cookie dough chunk puffs are now back. So if you like cookie dough, if you like fluffy marshmallow, and of course, if you like 100% chocolate, and when I talk about cookie dough, by the way, I'm talking about chocolate chip cookie dough, not just standard cookie dough, chocolate chip cookie dough, covered in 100% chocolate with the soft marshmallow bed as well. These are the perfect protein bars, y'all, if you want to check them out. You can find them over at Built.com, or you can find them in your local Walmart or Sam's Club as well. you can head over to built.com to check out their extensive collection of protein bars, or you can go to Walmart. So you can pick up a 4-box in the pharmacy section that includes great flavors like cookies and cream, double chocolate, coconut puffs, or you can head over to Sam's Club, get that Baker's Dozen 13-box that has their hit flavors, brownie batter, and churro. Don't worry, you can thank me later. These are packed with 17 grams of protein, 130 calories, 4 grams of sugar, though. That's it. Make sure you head over to built.com, Walmart, or Sam's Club today to get the best tasting protein bar on the market. All right, family, continuing on with today's episode of Locked On Saints. Thanks as always, making us your first listen of the day. Coming up here in a moment, we're going to be chatting with Brad Spielberger, cap specialist at Pro Football Focus, as well as a contributor overthecap.com. You can follow him on Twitter at PFF_Brad to get all of your salary cap needs. And Brad's got a lot of love for the city of New Orleans as well. So he understands what the Saints are doing with the salary cap. So if you want a cap specialist that gets it, this is the guy for you. And here's Brad to kick us off with how or whether or not the salary cap moves that the Saints have been making over the course of the last few years, kicking the can down the road, restructures, all that. Will the salary cap actually ever catch up with New Orleans? Here's what Brad had to say.
Yeah, I think the big thing is right now you're getting a ton of production out of older players, right? So you're kicking the cap down the road on guys like Cam Jordan, guys like DeMario Davis that still in their 30s have been awesome. So it hasn't been a problem yet. But when you lose some foundational core piece of the defense and you're trying to replace those guys and it's a little bit strict on the cap, that will be when we really see. Obviously, missing the playoffs the last 2 years is not ideal, but they've been able to spend and add pieces how they want. It's just kind of, figuring out that quarterback position is a problem for anyone, regardless of their cap situation.
Ain't that the truth? It's not like you're just going to go out there and find a quarterback and everything's going to be fine. You don't just put a body there, right? We've seen the New York Jets have, top 5 picks several times over the course of the last 10 years. And they're sort of in this. I mean, they're courting the same quarterback that the New Orleans Saints are courting right now in Derek Carr. So we'll see exactly where it all comes together. But you mentioned the production from the older veteran players. That makes a big difference when we're having the conversation around restructuring, doesn't it?
100%. Because you do, look, if you have a fully guaranteed salary on a young player that is going to be there, it's not really, it doesn't matter if you restructure that money, right? You push down the line, it's going to hit regardless. When you're talking about guys that are in the tail end of their contracts that, again, these guys have been super healthy, but if it's guys that had injury issues or production had fallen off dramatically, also not really a concern yet, and you're still then pushing cap down the line, that's where it becomes a problem. But, they haven't really gotten there yet, thankfully. But, we are getting close to, at some point, Cam Jordan's got to start missing some games.
Eventually, right?
His durability is off the charts. So,
yeah, he's been outstanding. I mean, what did it take? It took the COVID year for him to miss one game, and it took a fractured orbital bone for him to miss a game last year. And Brad, when I tell you they had to fight to keep him off the field, they had to fight to keep him off the field. You know how it goes. Cam's personality, he wants to be out there. So that makes a big difference when it comes to all this. And I think the other thing, too, that I've always looked at when it comes to will the salary cap catch up with the New Orleans Saints is how much success can you have before it does, right? And what's the definition of it doing? They kind of took a little bit of a hit a couple years ago, along with the rest of the NFL when the salary cap dropped for the first time in forever, right? With the COVID season and all that. So finding success in the next couple of years kind of colors the way that we look at this in the future.
100%. And I think the last piece, too, is if you hit a draft class like 2017, which, look, 2017 is a historically good class. But the way you can kind of steer out of this storm is if you keep hitting on these young, surplus value players, and it enables you to balance the books between some kind of bloated contracts with these good young players. Unfortunately, when you have a guy like a Peyton Turner, a first-round pick that's kind of, doesn't play all the time, when you have some of those draft classes that everyone has, or it's not as great, that's when it really can catch up to you. You can't avoid it if you just keep adding awesome young talent, but that's very, very, very hard to do in this league.
Yeah, in 2022's draft class, we'll see where that one is. I mean, obviously, Chris Olave had a great year. Alontae Taylor looked spectacular in the times that he got an opportunity to play, but you kind of want to see where the Trevor Penning of it all lands, because he started off the season with a foot injury, ended the season with a foot injury, Liz Frank injury. Those aren't, and the first one was a really serious turf toe injury. Those aren't great when you're an offensive lineman. So 2023 might tell us a little bit about how successful they might be able to be based upon that 2022 draft class, yeah?
100%, right. You get growth from him, maybe growth from Cesar Ruiz as well. But yeah, we need to rename turf toe because it sounds like this non-serious injury.
I know, right?
A terrible injury. Yeah, I mean, Penning, I also think there was going to be an adjustment period of the game. So in a way, maybe it worked out for him where, he learned the NFL behind the scenes a little bit, got coached up obviously by a great coaching staff and a great offensive line staff that has continued to just make players incredible at that position group. But yeah, that's a big piece of it. If you're trading first round picks, you'll get these guys, especially they got to deliver for you. And obviously you have tackle depth right now, but he's got to take over for Hurst on the left side eventually. And if he does look good and you have him and Ramczyk, then, you're cooking with gas once again.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a good chance that this team ends up reinvesting in its offensive line this offseason as well. Andres Pete's contract, of course, is a lingering sort of will they, won't they, what are they going to do around that? He could potentially be a post-June 1 transaction that saves quite a bit of money, at least post-June 1. But do they need that money right now? And if they do, then restructuring would probably be the option. But you mentioned the offensive line coaching staff, Doug Marrone, Zach Strief, of course, now on his way to Denver, and they had Jari Evans working with him. I mean, can you get a better offensive line staff like here than those guys who have played in this system? Like, how important is that for Trevor Penning's growth?
I think we underestimate how much value there is in a great offensive line coach. You look at the Philadelphia Eagles and Jeff Stoutland. You talk to anyone in that building, they talk about Stoutland University and how he's the most important coach in the entire building. You have Bill Callahan in Cleveland who just brings players in and makes them into all pros. And the Saints have been the same. I know Strafe now going to Denver to coach with Sean Payton, but I think you have, a foundation in place and obviously can pass down some of those methodologies and things you're doing. But it matters so much developing your young offensive linemen. I think with Penning, I know everyone's probably heard this and seen the videos and whatnot. I had a video of his from the Senior Bowl where he's just trying to kill everyone every single rep. He has the mentality and the desire. If you can hone those skills and maybe control that energy a little bit, I think you could become a good player.
Yeah, and I think he did a good job with control. I mean, during training camp, we watched him get into a couple of, what do we call them? Tussles, I guess is the right word. There's a word that we use in training camp all the time. It'll come to me later on. But, he had a couple of those moments there. And then during the regular season, when he started to get involved after he came back from that turf toe injury later on in the year, didn't really seem to have any issues, but definitely finished a lot of plays. So that aggression, that tenacity, very much still there for him. Last piece on the salary cap here with you, Brad, looking at Khai Harley, who of course is the Saints salary cap guru. And then you have, you've got Mickey Loomis, of course, at the top of it all. The Saints have done so many different things with contracts. Void years, they created that really incredibly confusing for a lot of people Taysom Hill contract that was kind of this dual incentive built, maybe quarterback, maybe tight end contract. They're restructuring fifth-year options. They're putting in roster bonus money so that they can restructure it later. Are we just seeing this more here in New Orleans because it's right in front of us, or are the New Orleans Saints really doing a lot of unique things with the contract like we believe they are across the NFL?
Oh, they totally are. I've been fortunate to meet Khai. I went to Tulane Law School, so he would come help us out with the football competition we do. And I joked once, my job is figuring out what you guys are doing sometimes. So, thank you for teaching me new things to do with the salary cap, because otherwise it probably wouldn't have crossed my path if you hadn't done it. So they really are. There's a bunch of things I could name that I didn't really fully understand, or at least didn't see at every team unless the Saints were doing it. So they are. They're creative. They really know how to dig into the CBA and find new ways and different ways to take advantage of the rules. And they deserve credit for, being that creative and doing all that work. A couple other teams, the Eagles kind of get into the weeds a little bit of that too, but the Saints definitely lead the charge of how to manipulate this thing to the fullest degree.
All right, family, coming up next, Brad and I are going to take a deep dive into the non-quarterback needs of the New Orleans Saints and present some options for how the Saints can fill them up over the offseason. What's the biggest need behind quarterback? Brad and I have that coming up for you as we continue on to wrap up today's episode of Locked On Saints. Let's get it. Who Dat Nation, wrapping up today's episode of Locked On Saints with Brad Spielberger at PFF_. Brad, almost said Brad _PFF. I'm losing my mind. At PFF_ Brad. And here's Brad and I's conversation on non-QB needs for the New Orleans Saints and where they can make some big strides at improving their team in 2023.
I think it is interior defensive line. And they extended the window to maybe work something out with David Onyemata by pushing back the date when his contract voids. They did him and Marcus Davenport and maybe, an inkling of, are they trying to get something done? But But if they don't, I think that is the most pressing need for this team right now. They obviously have some solid players at edge. Granderson coming along has been great to see.
Yep.
Some young players that maybe can take some more steps. But I think up the middle right now, especially with what Kapasanan's a free agent, even some of the smaller contributors are maybe on the way out. I think that is the biggest need for this team right now.
You know, they have absolutely no defensive tackles on contract going into 2023. Like everyone,
not great.
Yeah, not great at all. Not great at all. And everybody that's, you know, watching, listening here, Locked On Saints, the moment that you said interior defensive line, they all went because they're raving up. They're ready. They're like, oh, here Ross goes again, because Ross talks about interior defensive line all the time, and I do, and I think everybody does appreciate it. But the thing about it is that like they have nobody under contract right now in 2023. Shai Tuttle, Malcolm Roach. David Onyemata, as you mentioned, they pushed the void year back or the contract void date back, but he's still not technically under contract going into 2023. Kentavious Street, who they signed this past offseason, had a pretty solid year with them. Very likely that he hits the market to see if he can build on that and find himself a nice contract, but not under contract for the New Orleans Saints in 2023. For me, it's bringing back David Onyemata becomes kind of the biggest maybe must for them when it comes to addressing that position. But outside of that, they've got some real unique competition across the division in Atlanta, because that's where Ryan Nielsen, the former defensive line coach for the team, just went. So he might be courting some of these guys. So are there some fits that make sense for the New Orleans Saints if they were to maintain David Onyemata that they could go out and add to that rotation?
Yeah, and fortunately for them, you know, I do our free agency work, and I actually, for the first time this year, kind of graded the quality of the players available at each position. And it's one of the best interior defensive line groups in free agency in a while. So,
good timing.
Well, we'll see. Deron Payne probably going to get franchise tag, but still, you know, a good group. I think a guy like Larry Ogunjobi played last year with the Pittsburgh Steelers, former Cleveland Brown, former Cincinnati Bengal, would be a good fit opposite Onyemata as more of kind of a run stuffer, one tech, can kick outside of three tech, but I think would play well with Onyemata as kind of a different player with different responsibilities. You know, I don't think he's going to totally break the bank. If they're looking for more of a pass rushing type guy, I think Morgan Fox with the Los Angeles Chargers is a guy that can really get upfield in a hurry, make some plays in the backfield. And then one more kind of stout run stuffer, I think it's a little bit cheaper, would be A'Shawn Robinson, who's with the Los Angeles Rams, a former Detroit Lions draft pick, one of the better run defenders, really just an early down player, but still addresses, you know, that issue very well by himself. A really good run stuffer.
Yeah, I really like A'Shawn Robinson a lot. I'd love to see him end up being in New Orleans. But the Morgan Fox one makes a lot of sense, because I tend to think about their draft for finding the pass rushing interior defensive linemen. But those guys are available in free agency as well. And you know they can produce at the NFL level, which I think is a key thing, right? You go and grab one of those pass rushing interior defensive linemen like a Kalijah Kancey in the draft out of Pittsburgh. Great in college, but is his size, is he going to be able to translate to the next level? Don't have to ask that question as much with guys that are coming in free agency. Beyond defensive tackle, Brad, I think running back is a place that we're going to be watching big time this offseason. Obviously, with the Alvin Kamara situation, legal situation, taking its next step, trial on March 2nd. We'll see what the NFL discipline is after the legal process is wrapped up, because they don't want to influence the legal process in any way. But seems very likely that a minimum of 6-game suspension, according to the NFL's code of conduct policy, could be on the way for Alvin Kamara. Even with Alvin Kamara on the roster, I think you still need to bolster that running back room. Does that feel like a spot where you could see them putting a lot of focus?
I agree. And they obviously have always loved having multiple players they can play there and diverse skill sets and do different things. Again, kind of works out. It's a ridiculously talented and deep free agent class at running back this year. So, hey, it's all the stars are aligning for the Saints in terms of their needs and who's available. But so I do agree, and I think it is going to be, you know, a buyer's market, so to speak. The draft class is also good. I mean, again, they're not going after the big fish, but we saw, you know, a guy like Aaron Jones take a pay cut for a reason, because they realize, like, this market is just not going to be super strong. So I think it is a spot where they could look to add more talent. You know, who that looks like or how much they want to pay is a different story, but there are a ton of players available. And if they wanted to add there, I think they could. And it wouldn't really break the bank for them at all.
Yeah, I wish that Rashad Penny didn't have the injury concerns that he has, because I feel like he would be a really good option for New Orleans as somebody that can come in place of Alvin Kamara and create some production. Maybe, you know, Eno Benjamin sticks around so that you still get a little bit of a change of pace back. That's a part of it. But I feel like Rashad Penny and Alvin Kamara would actually pair very well as well, kind of reminiscent of the way that Mark Ingram and Alvin Kamara of 2017-18, the role split, not necessarily the production, because here we are 5 years later, but the role split would be pretty good between those two guys. But there are some other names out there for sure. And of course, there's an electrifying running back draft class upcoming this year for sure too. I look at wide receiver as kind of the next spot. Dennis Allen saying that the one thing that they didn't have in 2022 that they really wanted was the contested catch receiver, especially after Michael Thomas's season came to an end much earlier than any of us had hoped and expected. Are there guys like that are available? Because I know there's one name that jumps out to me, and it's Alan Lazard. But are there other guys available that could fill that role?
Yeah, I think another interesting name, if you're looking for kind of a big body contested catch guy, would be former LSU guy DJ Chark. Maybe not the most physical player that you're looking for, but can make some of those 50-50 balls go up and get it type catches. I think he'd be an interesting addition as well. It's unfortunately not a very good free agent class at wide receiver, but I think actually mocked Lazard going to them at one point. I think that does make a lot of sense. Also a good blocker, again, 6'5", 230, kind of built like a tight end almost. And you've kind of, the Saints have done a lot of work with those tweener type players in the past and gotten a lot out of them. So, yeah, I think they could find that skill set, obviously with Olave, kind of becoming the top option, but then a good, solid number 2, reliable, third down, good hands type of guy. They're out there.
And then last one for you, just taking a look at tight end Juwan Johnson. We're very excited about him here in New Orleans. For you, looking at he's going to be a restricted free agent, but comparing him to the free agent class where they, on the open market, still kind of feels like Juwan Johnson is their best option. And it should be pretty easy for them to keep him around thanks to restricted free agent contracts, tenders, things like that. How important is a guy like Juwan Johnson in keeping him in New Orleans?
Yeah, he's kind of, I guess, the guy I'm thinking of, but I'm thinking about kind of like a tweener, right? Like he is a tight end, but he kind of is also this big slot type player in today's NFL. I think it is important. I think he's become a focal point in specific areas of the field and can do things that, you're not really going to find in free agency unless, frankly, with tight end, like there's not really a secondary market. It's like the guys paid at the top are paid just much more than the second tier. It's kind of a weird position group. So, I think he is an important piece to keep around. They obviously will put that RFA tender on him, and then going back to our cap conversation, they'll probably restructure a restricted free agent, which I had not seen until Deontay Hardy left.
Big shout out to Brad. Big shout out for you to making it to another episode of Locked On Saints. Coming up tomorrow, we're going to be chatting with Darian Gray, host of Locked On HBCU, about some of the HBCU Legacy Bowl standouts, and it's Wednesday, so it's midweek fundamentals. Which drills at the combine are most important for which positions? What should you be watching for your favorite prospects? We'll break it all down position by position in tomorrow's episode and get you those HBCU prospects as well. Thank you very much, as always, for making Locked On Saints your first listen of the day. For your second listen, make sure you go and check out Locked On NFL Draft. Damian Parson, Keith Sanchez, bringing you everything you need to know about your favorite draft prospects, including the sleepers that can help change your favorite NFL franchise. Find it today wherever you get your podcast and on YouTube as well. Part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thanks so much, as always, making us a part of your day, part of your routine, for saying yes to me and the show. And as always, if you see me, say hi. If you need anything else around your New Orleans Saints in between these episodes, make sure you follow me on Twitter at Ross Jackson, NOLA. Hit me up. Let me know how the family's doing. Let me know how you're living. Let me know how your mom and them. And trust you, that nation. I'll holla at you.